You've been told that empaths who prefer staying home are just introverted, that they're avoiding life, being antisocial, hiding from the world. But Carl Jung discovered something that will completely shatter this narrative. When he studied empaths who had genuinely awakened, who had done the deep psychological work of integration, he found that their preference for solitude wasn't avoidance at all. It was something far more profound and far more disturbing to the people around them. Jung spent decades documenting a pattern that appeared in every empath who reached what he called psychological maturity. They stopped wanting to be around people, not because they were depressed or traumatized or broken, but because they had developed a level of consciousness that made most social interaction feel like psychological violence. They could see things others couldn't see. They could feel dynamics others were blind to. And being in spaces where everyone was operating unconsciously became unbearable in ways that people who hadn't awakened could never understand. The awakened empath's withdrawal wasn't antisocial behavior. It was self-preservation in response to a specific perceptual shift that changed how they experienced reality. And this shift, Jung discovered, was irreversible. Once an empath awakened to this level of awareness, they could never go back to experiencing social situations the way unconscious people did. The veil had lifted, and what they saw underneath the performance of normal social life was so exhausting, so draining, so fundamentally dishonest that staying home became the only way to protect their psychological integrity. Today, I'm going to reveal what Jung discovered about why awakened empaths prefer solitude, the specific shift in consciousness that makes social interaction unbearable, why this withdrawal is actually a sign of health rather than dysfunction, and what it means if you've been experiencing this pull toward isolation, while everyone around you insists something's wrong with you. Jung's investigation into this pattern began with patients who came to him worried they were becoming agoraphobic or depressed. These were empaths who had done significant psychological work. They'd integrated their shadow. They'd broken their codependent patterns. They'd established boundaries. They'd individuated to a degree most people never reach. By every measure of Jung's framework, they were psychologically healthy. But they had one troubling symptom. They didn't want to be around people anymore. They'd attend social gatherings and feel drained within minutes. They'd go to work and come home depleted. They'd interact with family and need days to recover. Even people they loved felt exhausting to be near, and they couldn't understand why. They'd done the work. They'd healed. They should be able to engage with the world. But something had shifted, and the shift made being around others feel intolerable. Jung initially thought this was a new dysfunction emerging, but as he studied more cases, he recognized it wasn't dysfunction at all. It was the natural consequence of a specific transformation that occurred when empaths reached genuine awakening. He called it the development of penetrative perception, the ability to see through social performance to the psychological reality operating beneath it. Most people experience social interactions at face value. Someone says they're fine, and the interaction proceeds as if they're fine. Someone performs confidence, and that confidence is accepted as real. Someone presents their persona, and everyone relates to the persona as if it's the whole person. This allows social interaction to flow smoothly because everyone agrees to only see the surface. But awakened empaths had lost the ability to see only surface reality. They perceived multiple layers simultaneously. When someone said they were fine, the empath felt the depression underneath. When someone performed confidence, the empath saw the insecurity driving it. When someone presented their persona, the empath perceived the shadow material being hidden, and they couldn't turn this perception off. This wasn't the same as the sensitivity unhealed empaths experience. Unhealed empaths absorb emotions and get overwhelmed. But awakened empaths weren't absorbing anymore. They'd done the boundary work. They'd learned to separate their energy from others. They could perceive someone's emotional state without taking it on. So, this wasn't about being overwhelmed by feelings. This was about perception. Awakened empaths had developed the ability to see psychological structure. They could perceive defense mechanisms operating in real time. They could recognize projection, denial, displacement, rationalization as these patterns were happening. They could see the unconscious motivations beneath conscious behavior. And this perception was constant, automatic, and exhausting. Jung discovered this shift occurred specifically in empaths who had done deep shadow work. Because shadow work requires you to see your own unconscious patterns clearly, to recognize when you're projecting, defending, denying. And once you've developed that ability to see your own psychology this clearly, you can't help but see everyone else's psychology the same way. Think about watching a movie after you've studied filmmaking. You can't just watch the story anymore. You see the camera angles, the editing choices, the lighting techniques. The magic is gone because you see the construction underneath. This is what happens to awakened empaths in social situations. They can't just experience the interaction. They see all the psychological mechanics operating beneath it. And once you see the mechanics, you can't unsee them. The exhaustion this creates isn't emotional, it's cognitive. Awakened empaths are processing exponentially more information than everyone else in the room. While others are having a surface conversation, the empath is simultaneously tracking the spoken content, the emotional subtext, the power dynamics, the defense mechanisms, the projection patterns, the unconscious material emerging. Their consciousness is doing work that no one else's consciousness is doing, and this work is relentless. Jung found that awakened empaths would come home from a simple dinner party completely depleted, not because anything dramatic happened, but because they spent 3 hours perceiving and processing psychological complexity that everyone else was completely unaware of. They watched people perform. They saw the contradictions between what people said and what they felt. They recognized patterns that predicted future dysfunction. And they did all of this while pretending to just be having a normal conversation. This created what Jung called double consciousness. The awakened empath had to maintain 2 levels of awareness simultaneously. They had to participate in the surface conversation everyone else was having, but they were also witnessing all the unconscious dynamics playing out beneath it. And maintaining both levels of consciousness at once was cognitively exhausting in ways that were invisible to everyone around them. But here's where Jung's observation becomes crucial. The exhaustion wasn't the only reason awakened empaths started preferring solitude. It was also the dishonesty. Because awakened empaths weren't just seeing unconscious patterns. They were seeing that everyone was pretending these patterns weren't there. Everyone was agreeing to only acknowledge the surface level, and this collective agreement to ignore deeper reality felt like mass delusion to the awakened empath. Imagine being in a room where everyone is pretending something isn't happening that you can clearly see is happening. Someone is being passive-aggressive, but everyone pretends they're just being nice. Someone is dominated by their spouse, but everyone pretends it's a normal relationship. Someone is desperately insecure, but everyone reflects back the confidence they were performing, and you're the only one who sees the actual reality beneath the performance. This is what social situations feel like for awakened empaths. They're surrounded by collective denial, and they have to choose whether to maintain the denial with everyone else or to acknowledge what they're actually perceiving. Most of the time, acknowledging what they perceive doesn't go well. People get defensive. They accuse the empath of being judgmental or negative. They insist the empath is seeing things that aren't there. Because for people still operating unconsciously, the deeper layers aren't visible. So the empath's perception feels like projection rather than accurate observation. Jung documented countless examples of awakened empaths trying to participate authentically in social situations only to be shut down, gaslit, or ostracized. They'd gently point out a dynamic they were observing, and people would react as if they'd said something cruel or inappropriate. They'd try to have deeper conversations, and people would deflect back to surface topics. They'd refuse to participate in gossip or performance, and they'd be labeled as difficult or antisocial. The message was clear. Social acceptance requires participating in the collective agreement to only see surface reality. If you see deeper and refuse to pretend you don't, you won't be welcome. So awakened empaths faced an impossible choice. Pretend you only see what everyone else sees, or be honest about your perception and face rejection. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises, inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Most awakened empaths tried pretending for a while. They'd go to social gatherings and perform normalcy. They'd engage in surface conversations and act like they weren't seeing the psychological warfare happening underneath. They'd watch people destroy themselves with unconscious patterns and smile and nod as if everything was fine. But Jung found that this pretending created a different kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of betraying your own perception. Because awakened empaths had spent years learning to see clearly, they'd done brutal shadow work to stop lying to themselves. They'd developed the capacity for honest self-observation, and now they were being asked to deny that same capacity in social situations, to pretend they didn't see what they clearly saw, to participate in collective dishonesty after years of learning to live in truth. This is what Jung identified as the core bind. Awakened empaths couldn't participate in normal social interaction without betraying their consciousness. But if they honored their consciousness, they couldn't participate in normal social interaction. There was no way to do both, and this realization that full participation in social life required them to abandon their hard-won awareness is what made solitude feel necessary rather than optional. Jung observed that awakened empaths would initially feel guilty about their withdrawal. They had been socialized to believe that healthy people want to be around others. That isolation means something's wrong. That if you prefer being alone, you're avoiding or hiding or damaged. So they'd force themselves to keep participating while feeling increasingly depleted and dishonest. But at some point, something would shift. They'd realize that the cost of participation was too high, that pretending to be unconscious when you're conscious is a form of self-violence, that honoring your perception matters more than social approval, and they'd start saying no, declining invitations, reducing contact, creating more space for solitude. And this withdrawal, Jung discovered, was actually a sign of health. Because awakened empaths weren't isolating out of fear or trauma, they were choosing solitude from a place of psychological integrity. They were protecting the consciousness they had worked so hard to develop. They were refusing to betray their perception just to make others comfortable. And they were recognizing that being alone felt more authentic than being surrounded by people while pretending to be someone they were no longer. Jung emphasized that this preference for solitude looked like dysfunction to unconscious people. Family members would worry, friends would feel rejected. Therapists who didn't understand the awakening process would diagnose depression or anxiety. Because from the outside, withdrawal looks like a problem. But Jung insisted that for awakened empaths, withdrawal was often the healthiest response to an environment that demanded unconsciousness as the price of belonging. The solitude awakened empaths craved wasn't about avoiding people, it was about accessing themselves. Because Jung found that awakened empaths only felt like themselves when they were alone. In social situations, they had to manage everyone else's perception, had to modulate their awareness so others didn't feel threatened, had to perform enough normalcy to avoid being labeled as strange or difficult. But alone, they could drop all performance, could perceive freely, could exist without having to pretend they were less aware than they actually were. This is what made home feel sacred to awakened empaths. Home was the space where they didn't have to manage consciousness, didn't have to pretend, didn't have to participate in collective denial. They could see clearly, feel deeply, exist authentically without anyone demanding they dim their awareness. And after spending time in environments that required constant self-betrayal, coming home felt like returning to themselves. Jung observed that awakened empaths would often create elaborate home environments designed to support their consciousness. Not in showy ways, but in subtle ones. They'd curate spaces that felt peaceful. They'd eliminate stimulation that cluttered their perception. They'd establish rituals that helped them process the psychological complexity they'd witnessed in the world. They treated their home as a sanctuary not from life, but for their consciousness. But here's what Jung found most significant. The awakened empath's withdrawal wasn't permanent isolation. They didn't become hermits who never engage with anyone. They became highly selective about engagement. They could participate in the world, but only in ways that didn't require betraying their awareness. And they sought out the rare individuals who could also see beneath surface reality. Jung documented that awakened empaths would often have very small social circles consisting entirely of other awakened people. Not because they were elitist or exclusive, but because conversation with other people who could see clearly was fundamentally different than conversation with unconscious people. With other awakened individuals, they didn't have to pretend, didn't have to hide their perception, didn't have to participate in collective denial. They could speak honestly about what they saw, and the other person would understand because they saw it too. These relationships were rare but profound, and Jung found that awakened empaths would often prefer one authentic connection with someone who could meet them in full consciousness over dozens of surface relationships with people who required them to perform unconsciousness. Quality over quantity wasn't just preference, it was necessity. Because awakened empaths had limited energy for managing perception, and they wanted to spend that energy on connections that honored rather than denied their awareness. This selectivity made awakened empaths appear antisocial to people who didn't understand what was happening. But Jung was adamant that this wasn't antisocial behavior, it was conscious relationship. Awakened empaths weren't rejecting people randomly. They were making deliberate choices about who had access to them based on whether those people could engage authentically or whether engagement required performance and pretending. Jung also discovered that awakened empaths' relationship to solitude changed their relationship to loneliness. Unconscious people often can't tolerate being alone because they experience it as loneliness, but awakened empaths experience solitude as connection to themselves, to their perception, to reality unfiltered by collective denial. They weren't lonely when alone. They were often lonely in crowds, surrounded by people they couldn't be real with. This distinction was crucial for Jung. Loneliness isn't about being physically alone. It's about being unable to share your authentic experience with others. Awakened empaths felt profoundly lonely in social situations where no one could see what they saw. But alone, engaging with their own consciousness without having to translate or justify it to anyone, they felt accompanied by their own awareness. Solitude became the space where loneliness dissolved because they could be fully themselves without abandonment. Jung taught awakened empaths to trust this pull towards solitude rather than pathologizing it. He'd ask them, when you're alone, do you feel depleted or restored? When you're in social situations, do you feel connected or like you're performing? The answers revealed whether withdrawal was dysfunction or health. If solitude restored them and social interaction depleted them, their preference for staying home wasn't a problem to fix. It was wisdom to honor. But Jung also warned about the danger of using solitude to avoid all human connection, because complete isolation could become another form of defense. The awakened empath could use their superior perception as justification for total withdrawal, convincing themselves that no one could meet them, that engagement was pointless, that they were too aware for human relationship. And this could become spiritual bypassing in reverse, using consciousness as a reason to avoid the vulnerability of connection. The balance Jung advocated was selective engagement. Stay home when being around unconscious people requires self-betrayal, but remain open to connection with those rare individuals who can meet you in genuine awareness. Don't force yourself into social situations that deplete you, but don't completely close yourself off from human contact either. Be alone without becoming isolated. Be selective without becoming superior. This required awakened empaths to develop what Jung called conscious solitude, the ability to be alone without closing your heart, to withdraw from environments that demanded unconsciousness while remaining open to authentic connection when it appeared, to protect your awareness without using it as a fortress, to honor your need for solitude without making it an identity that prevents real intimacy. Jung observed that awakened empaths who mastered this balance appeared paradoxical to others. They could be completely content alone for extended periods, but when they did engage, they were capable of profound presence and intimacy. They weren't avoiding people, they were avoiding performance. And when they found people who didn't require performance, they could connect at depths that unconscious people never reached. This is what made the awakened empath's solitude threatening to family and friends, because it revealed that the empath had outgrown relationships that required them to stay small, unconscious, or performative. Their withdrawal wasn't rejection of specific people, it was rejection of the dynamics those relationships were built on. And people whose relationships depended on the empath remaining unconscious experienced that rejection as abandonment. Jung was clear that awakened empaths needed to accept that their transformation would cost relationships. Not every connection could survive their awakening. Some people were only comfortable with the unconscious version of the empath. And when that version died, those people would either need to meet the awakened version or leave. This was painful, but necessary. The empath couldn't maintain relationships by betraying their consciousness. The real reason awakened empaths prefer staying home, Jung concluded, is that home is where they can exist without self-betrayal, where they can perceive clearly without being punished for it, where they can honor their consciousness without having to justify it, where they can rest from the exhaustion of pretending to be less aware than they are. Home isn't escape from life, it's refuge for consciousness in a world that demands unconsciousness as the price of participation. If you're an awakened empath who's been feeling guilty about preferring solitude, Jung would tell you this. Your withdrawal isn't dysfunction, it's not avoidance, it's not antisocial behavior. It's the natural consequence of developing the ability to see clearly in a world that operates on collective denial. You're not broken because you don't want to participate in performances. You're awake. And staying awake requires protecting yourself from environments that demand you go back to sleep. Your preference for solitude is honoring the consciousness you worked so hard to develop. It's refusing to betray your perception. It's recognizing that being alone feels more authentic than being surrounded by people you can't be real with. And this isn't something to fix, it's something to trust. You're not avoiding life by staying home. You're protecting the life you've discovered inside yourself. The life that exists beneath all the performance and pretending. The life that can only breathe freely when you're not managing everyone else's perception of you. That life is precious. And choosing solitude to protect it isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing you can do. Jung believed that awakened empaths were evolutionary pioneers, that their ability to perceive beneath surface reality was what allowed humanity to see its own unconsciousness and eventually transform. But he also knew that pioneers are always lonely. They see what others don't see. They go where others aren't ready to go. And they often walk alone because the path they're on hasn't been traveled by enough others to create company. Your solitude is the price of consciousness, but it's also the space where consciousness deepens, where you can see without distraction, where you can integrate without interference, where you can become more fully yourself without having to fragment into acceptable pieces. Stay home when you need to, without guilt, without apologizing, without explaining to people who can't understand. Your awakening matters more than their approval. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.